Hello there, kia ora. Have you noticed our mainstream media seems to be sliding further to the right? You might not have. It's been gradual, and we don't often see it happening when we're exposed to slight changes every day over an extended period of time, but it is happening. Over the past couple of years, we've seen subtle changes that indicate the bias shift. Less stories focusing on systemic issues, more focus on fiscal narratives and cultural war topics, an increase on bad news clickbait, an increase in the way left wing sources are framed as neutral, while right wing sources are given more authoritative titles like expert or commentator. There's more right wing voices being used as sources, and that shifts disproportionately how we go around downplaying groups like unions, social justice advocates, or public sector experts if they directly contradict a right wing media narrative. Well, there is a reason for it, and we can't blame it on people like Mike Hosking or Ryan Bridge. They are symptoms, not the cause. But we can find out the reason why using something called the propaganda model. This is Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky. You might recognize Noam, who isn't an actual gnome, from memes that uncle that you no longer invite to Christmas used to share on Facebook at the height of the pandemic about propaganda. Before your uncle realized that Chomsky was pro-vaccination and an anti-Zionist Ashkenazi Jewish immigrant, so woke and therefore bad. In 1988, these two came up with something called the propaganda model, and people often assume that that means, well, this kind of propaganda, with the rallies and Elon's Roman salute. But it's actually the term they use to describe the unseen forces which shape our mainstream media narratives. There's 5 of these filters, and together they combine to serve the interests of the government and corporates by marginalizing dissent and promoting a specific agenda. They're like the Captain Planet of news. There's ownership. Who actually owns the media companies so they get to say what gets reported? There's advertising. Since they're a major source of revenue, media outlets prioritize content that appeals to them. There's news sources like government responses, which might seem neutral but are often managed by PR and spin teams. There's flack, the pressure to put on media by the likes of lawyers or governments to deter media from publishing things that they don't think make them look good. And there's fear, where news is framed around a common enemy to distract from details and facts to justify specific policies. By these 5 powers combined, we have the propaganda model. But back when this was first written in 88, when George Bush the first was elected president and the first known computer worm was created, media looked really different. It was mostly newspapers, lots of them at local levels, and a few big nationwide ones, and news shows, and was generally considered just right of centrist. But the public believed it was centrist. Under the conditions in 88, if a media outlet started shifting its bias one way or the other in such a small market of media types, their competition tended to go the opposite direction to pick up audiences that the other was alienating. But that was then. We live in the future now. Over the past 20 years, we've seen a democratization of media access with the rise of the internet, which has led to a shift in the way that the public consumes news. Gone are a lot of the smaller localized newspapers, and the bigger newspapers have diversified into multimedia options because more people were sourcing news online. The 2025 Trusted Media report from AUT showed 57% of Kiwis got news from Facebook, 43% got it from YouTube, and 17% get it from TikTok. That made Facebook and YouTube the 4th and 5th largest news platform in the country behind Stuff, TVNZ, and The Herald. That report also had, for the first time ever, a localized online news site, Crux, which covers Queenstown, Wanaka, and Cromwell local news. And it's that rise of local online news media that's impacted our mainstream media. Online news that's not published in a paper or broadcast somewhere first isn't covered by the same laws and rules on fairness and accuracy. And generally, the outlets which have evolved from print into online spaces actually follow those rules pretty well. Crux is a good example of this. But we're not trained in spotting the difference between fairness or accuracy and bias. And our own individual bias leads us to have different ideals of what fairness and accuracy actually are. But those that have sprouted up out of a distrust of other media options, they tend to be much more hard right in their political bias and far less regulated in what they produce. They tend to blur the lines more between news and opinion, and they tend to feed the algorithms of social media really well, because those algorithms are based on conflict and interaction. They feed into people's bubbles and back up the opinions and views of those already within those biases. And as a country that has always had a slightly right-leaning independent media, large swathes of rural populations and undue influence from hard-right third-party groups like the Taxpayers Union, Free Speech Union, NZ Initiatives, Voices for Freedom, and more, these new hard-right, localized content producers have pulled audiences away from mainstream media while amplifying the elements that cause people to distrust it. Remember last year when the Herald faced a huge amount of backlash over this Hobson's Pledge ad? More than 170 academics and lawyers signed an open letter claiming that the ad was misleading and inaccurate. The Advertising Standards Complaints Board also ruled it a breach of advertising code, and the response led to the Herald pulling a second ad on the topic. Well, this irked the Free Speech Union. They, in their own words, quote, worked with some relatively large shareholders who were concerned that individuals who were presenting otherwise legal but unorthodox views were not having their ads accepted. They went on to encourage Jim Grennan, a Canadian-born billionaire private equity investor who ran one of those hard-right localized online news sites, to step in and take over, which he did, prompting concerns from the union that represents NZME staff. Concerns which suddenly ended up at the bottom of articles on the takeover from a range of media sources. Then, over the past 12 months, we've seen the way NZME content is promoted on socials, which continues that trend of increasingly pushing narratives about individual responsibility and vilification on hard-right concerns, downplaying systemic issues or individual concerns that may be seen as issues for the right wing, and increasing a focus on culture war topics. They've framed the headlines of pieces around conservative talking points, like vilifying groups which are part of a government-led narrative, like beneficiaries, young people, or gang members, and continue to platform spokespeople for organisations like the TPU, who are given titles of authority like Public Affairs Manager, Researcher, CEO, Economist, Policy Analysis, and Council Member. Let me show you this framing bias in action, okay? If we got rid of the collectibles and put me in a traditional-looking newsroom, and use my full list of qualifications highlighting my expertise in media studies down here, it adds a different level of authenticity to the content, but it's way too formal for my liking. It's one of the reasons why we see the TPU Curia poll so often used as a source for news stories, despite it being clearly linked to a lobby group and from a company that's no longer part of the regulatory structure for political polling. These organisations have become embedded as part of that NZME ecosystem, and they build on this by providing easy-to-understand media-friendly outputs, like that Curia poll. There's clear signs these outlets are moving more towards the content we see in those hard-right, online, independent media spheres. Now, as this move happens, the other media outlets have two options. They can either shift to the left to offer a counterpoint to the shift right, or they can shift to the right to take up a position that's now been vacated. And because there's already a lot of crossover and shared media infrastructure and resources between organisations here, stories shared, for example, between outlets, the use of a limited pool of experts and commentators, and an audience trained on media from a certain perspective, and our morning media cycle is still dominated by morning news headlines from the NZ Herald and News Talk ZB, which influence how people perceive an issue throughout the day, right up into the evening news shows, which then homogenizes a day's events instead of presenting single issues as they arise. The rest of our mainstream media has been moving towards the right. We can see that in a shift of content from organisations like RNZ, which has recently been using material written specifically by the New Zealand Initiative, and their promotion of things like the pre-packaged material, like the Curia poll. And there's been comments from high-ranked MPs about both RNZ and TVNZ funding being cut if they don't frame content the way these MPs wanted. Funding which is provided at arm's length with a legally protected guarantee of no direct government involvement to ensure media fairness. So if we go back to that list of influencers, ownership, advertising, sources, FLAC and FAIR, we can see how these have all, in recent years, shifted our mainstream media outlets to the right in terms of the political bias of what they're reporting. And there's a big difference between bias and accuracy, and most of us haven't been trained in spotting the difference. It's why Facebook comment sections are so filled with clearly biased interpretations of media coverage. But if you know what the bias is of a media outlet and can recognize the influence that leads to that bias, you have an extra tool in your toolkit to work out what the aim of the messaging is and who benefits from it the most, which is something that we should all take on board going into an election year. Hey, thanks for sticking around till the end of the video. While you're here, why not hit that like button or share the video or even subscribe to the channel. You could even become a paid YouTube member so you can see things released in advance, you get access to some exclusive content, and like all these awesome people, you get to have your name at the end of the credits as well.